Welcome, everyone, to Heart Failure Collaboratory Heart of the Matter. I'm Chris O'Connor, and we're here today with my distinguished colleagues to talk about device development, device trials, and the topic at hand today is class effects. And I want to have my colleagues introduce themselves. We'll start with Joann Lindenfeld.
Hi, everyone. Joann Lindenfeld. I'm a professor of medicine and heart failure transplant cardiologist at Vanderbilt.
Dr. Walsh.
I'm Minnow Walsh. I'm a heart failure transplant cardiologist at Ascension St. Vincent, Indianapolis, and I direct the heart failure program and clinical research here.
Dr. Abraham.
Yeah, Bill Abraham, professor of medicine at The Ohio State University. I'm a heart failure cardiologist and clinical trialist.
And Dr. Psotka.
Mitchell Psotka, Section Chief of Heart Failure and Transplant at Inova Shar Heart and Vascular with Dr. O'Connor. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Well, one of the topics that comes up is we always talk about the difference between device and drug trials, and we've talked about this on a previous podcast, but people have asked often, is there a class effect with devices? You know, drugs, there's a class effect, maybe more accepting of class effects when you've seen the 10th ACE inhibitor come down the pike and coming for approval for hypertension or for heart failure. But what about devices? It's more nuanced. And Bill, maybe you could kick us off here on why is it more nuanced about class effect with devices?
I think it's a bit more nuanced because oftentimes while, the devices may be similar, there may be important differences to them in regard to the delivery of therapy. So, I would say that if the delivery of therapy is fundamentally the same, let's take cardiac resynchronization therapy as an example. Early on when we were developing and studying CRT and looking at a variety of devices, fundamentally the therapy delivered was the same. And so there was no expectation that we would see differential effects based on different devices. And subsequently that proved to be true. The benefit and the magnitude of benefit across multiple CRT trials using multiple CRT devices was essentially the same. But one could envision devices that have, fundamental differences, which could influence the outcomes. And I hate to bring up a controversial area, but if you consider interatrial shunts as an example, different example here, you've got some that leave behind a permanent device. You have others that simply make a naked hole in the interatrial septum. You have a variety of shunt sizes from 5 millimeter to 10 millimeters. And so one might raise a question is, are all of those devices or approaches and various sizes of shunting, if shunting works, are all of them going to be proved to be effective to the same level, or are there going to be differences and perhaps there may not be a class effect? So I think a lot depends on whether or not the delivery of the therapy is fundamentally the same or in some way different.
Yeah, I think, Chris, if I can add to that, because I agree totally. I think the other thing is the materials in the device, specific device. So as Bill said, for atrial shunts, maybe the shunt size will be different, but sometimes materials are different and there's more thrombosis, or in the case of valves, well, the valves degenerate in a different way because the materials are different. So that's also different, where I don't think medications, usually I don't think the vehicles are all that much different to expect a difference. So that's another big difference, I think.
And the other difference, we've talked about it on a previous podcast, that operator experience is really important when you're considering a class effect, because they're not identical. And so whatever the implantation or whatever procedures required for the device therapy may be quite different, even though there's a lot of similarity between the devices.
Point.
Well, Mitch, a lot of good comments here. Mitch, what do you want to add?
I think that on our panel, we have a very educated group of device experts. And I would say that if you compare to drugs, the similar things exist, that demonstrating drug similarity or device similarity such that there can be considered a class effect can be easily thrown off by any small differences, as was mentioned, in the composition of the device or the composition of the drug. And so it's very hard, I think, in either case to arrive at the idea of a class effect unless you have multiple examples. I do think it's generally harder to get multiple examples in the device space compared to the drug space, particularly for our cardiovascular devices. And I think Bill brought up the really good one of CRT, where we now have multiple devices, evidence that it works across platforms. But I'm not sure that you could have a priori said that you knew that that was going to be the case without the evidence that it did work. And I think that if you're often thinking about a class effect, it really does come down to the details and your assessment that the devices you are comparing are substantially similar and really sufficiently similar to consider them that they are working in the exact same way. I do think conceptually, my only other comment is that in the setting of devices, you have a smaller issue with off-target effects. With drugs, you often have a lot of off-target effects that you're considering, whereas devices, they're often been conceptualized and built to achieve one singular purpose. And whether they do that the same to another device is really the question, and whether they're doing it effectively, if you haven't studied it before, is the question. I think you're dealing less with these off-target effects in general, although, of course, adverse events with all of these devices is clearly the more invasive, the higher risk of adverse events exists. So that would be how I would think about it. And I think it's a tough concept to really prove in general that you do have a class effect.
Now, the reason we gravitate to class effects, because, the human mind likes to, they're clumpers and splitters, right? And some of us like to clump things together and aggregate information together. But if we truly could understand how one could be in a class, the development process, the development time, the time to getting from start to finish could be significantly shorter if we knew it wasn't compromising safety, right? So let's try to borrow maybe from the drugs a little bit. The early version of guidelines tend to put things into classes. So if you said that, carvedilol, metoprolol, and bisoprolol for heart failure were kind of thrown in as, the evidence-based beta blockers for heart failure, and they were kind of anointed a class effect. Similarly with ramipril and captopril and enalapril. So let's say you had a device, a CRT device that came along, but you had you had wrapped it or put some additional device on it that coated it with antibiotics so that it significantly reduced infection rates. Would you have to do an outcomes trial, Mitch, with that device? Or could you borrow on the class?
I love that you asked me, and I think it would depend a lot on the specific characteristics of the device, as we mentioned. How much could this interfere with the efficacy of the device? How much could this potentially change the safety profile of the device? And I think a lot would depend on how much you think it was altered. I think on the device side, there clearly is this mechanism in place to determine that something is substantially similar to previous devices or known technology, and there's the ability to clear a device as opposed to providing pre-market approval. And so a lot of it would depend on these details, not just the concept of exactly, can you just add something to a device? Because on the device side, there really is this idea that you can iterate on a device that is known to be effective and further improve its benefit risk profile to be utilized over time. Whereas that doesn't really exist on the drug side.
Well, Joann, I'm coming to you, and you're the head of the device section of the FDA, cardiac devices. And I'm telling you, I've got a antibiotic coated CRT device, and I'm telling you, with in my mind, I believe that this is going to drop the safety risk, the infection risk, and I believe it's efficacious. Is that all you need? Is my word of mouth?
Yes, that's all I need, Chris. Now, of
Because
course,
Mitch is saying you need to demonstrate efficacy, so I got to do 1,000 patient outcome trial.
well, no, but these are all complex because once you coat a lead with something, you have to be sure it lasts as long, or
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
you don't have trouble with some lead malfunction. That's happened in the past in one device I remember. So if it does exactly the same thing, this exact same CRT, and it's just a different lead, you still would need, I think, some substantial you would still have to have some efficacy.
You
And
do, you
then-
have to, maybe everyone with the antibiotic coated device develops sepsis because they now have resistant organisms. I mean,
Right.
there's all kinds of things that could happen.
or do they develop thrombus on the lead more often than,
right.
those are the things that are difficult, I think.
Bill, this is a tough regulatory committee here today. I got this device that I just put some, ampicillin on it, amoxicillin, as staph, cephalosporin on it, and they're telling me I have to do 1,000 patient trial. The lead may fall off. I may get antibiotic resistance. I mean, this is unbelievable. They don't believe my word that it's safe and efficacious. What say you?
Well, I'd say you need a little bit of evidence here, and maybe there's some balance between, sort of pre-approval, post-approval, and, how this goes into the mix in terms of class effect, right? Maybe you need 100 patients and then ongoing surveillance beyond that. But, I think that there's something in between the extremes of no data, versus, a requirement for an oppressive amount of data.
Well, this would be an example where a post-market study, if done, could be very valuable because you're not looking for efficacy exactly of the device. You're looking for problems with the lead that might not have been present. So that's sort of a really
Safety
nice, I
thing.
think, safety stuff is a nice post-marketing thing.
Well, that's a good way to do it. So if we were to wrap up this discussion on class effects, Joanne, it sounds like we're still early in thinking that there could be class effects. I mean, in my mind, the only class effects we possibly have are CRT and maybe defibrillators. I mean, I'm sure there's other devices, but Bill gave a beautiful argument why we can't think about, intraarterial shunts because of all the difference in physiology and device. So we can't buy in class effects there. So we can't let, for example, one company borrow information from another trial because we're not going to agree that they're similar enough. Is there a space? Hemodynamic monitors, could that be a class effect?
Well, I think in a way the FDA approved the Cordello device without a randomized trial, sort of as a class effect, saying that it's safe and it measures what you said you're going to measure. They do not have a randomized trial. So I think that's already happened in the space of hemodynamic monitoring.
Okay.
And then
Mitch
to
is
speak to
smiling.
after the regulatory hurdles and we're out in the marketplace in big systems like we're all in, the class effect has a huge impact on how decisions are made as to what devices are used.
Right.
The class
Yes.
effect, and then your system may say, we're going to pick one, go ahead, decide which it's going to be, and we're not going to offer more than one device in this category.
I mean, that's a really good point we haven't talked about. We won't have a lot of time to do that, but I can tell you at one point at Duke, benazepril was the #1 ACE inhibitor for the treatment of heart failure because it was the cheapest on the formulary, not because it had good heart failure efficacy data. Mitch, what say you? Class effect not prime time yet?
Well, from a regulatory standpoint, it's hard to make the case, and there are a bunch of, as you mentioned, legal issues with using one company's data for another. I think where it does play in general is the proof of concept, right? If it's a new concept and you're not sure if it could work, that's very different as if there's a device or drug on the market that has been shown to work. You have less concern with the overall concept, more with the specifics of that intervention. Will it work the same as others? And so I do think the level of concern prior to doing the study, really regarding patient safety, diminishes a little if you have something on the market that's similar that you know can provide benefit. So I think that's, as you're doing the development study, trying to prove safety and effectiveness. I think when you're on the other end of it, right, we've already heard that the guidelines in particular and payers and health systems try to implement class effect, whether it is or is not there because of purchasing issues and other financial constraints. And so it's trying to find the balance between those two, with is the specificity of the exact drug or device that you're looking at, devices in this case, versus these practical considerations that come around cost and implementation by payers, health systems, practices, other sorts of things.
And Bill, final word for our audience on what can we take home about the class effect discussion?
Yeah, well, I would say that, I think the class effect does exist for some devices. As Mitch pointed out, that after the evidence is in. I think one of the important questions is, how much evidence do you need? Is it after you've got trials of 2 different CRT devices, or 3 different CRT devices, or 4 different CRT devices? How much do you need before you say the next one, doesn't have to have a randomized controlled trial of 500 patients to get approved? So I think it depends on what the level of evidence is here. How much do you need to be able to declare that class effect?
That's terrific. And I think what you all said, and Minnow and Mitch said in detail, is we really should move to harmonization of what we say is class effect across the regulatory definition, the guideline definitions, and the hospital decision-making definitions, because that's where the uncoupling occurs and the confusion occurs. So, well, terrific conversation on class effects and devices. Thank you, my colleagues, for being here today, and thank the audience for stepping in and listening to Class Effect in Devices. This is the Heart Failure Collaboratory, Heart of the Matter, and we look forward to hearing from you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.